Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Smita Keimel, and I am the President and CEO of the Natural Resource Governance Institute. For those of you who are new to us, NRGI is an international NGO that works to ensure that natural resources enable fair, prosperous, and sustainable societies rather than undermining them. Preventing extractive sector corruption is absolutely core to our mission. Today, we are very pleased to launch NRGI's new anti-corruption guidance for partners of state-owned enterprises and to explore how we can more effectively prevent extractive sector corruption together. We know that this challenge is formidable. Transparency International's latest Corruption Perception Index came out just yesterday, and countries dependent on natural resources scored on average 15 points worse than non-resource dependent countries. Out of the 15 lowest performing countries, 10 are resource dependent. We at NRGI have witnessed firsthand the harms that corruption causes. For people and policymakers in resource producing countries, corruption leads to lost revenues, often in nations where poverty rates already run high. UNCTAD estimates that $88 billion in illicit financial flows leave the African continent every year, nearly twice the total amount of official development assistance. Corruption also erodes governance and public trust within the sector and well beyond, so that public institutions no longer serve the public interest. As a result, economies struggle to advance. Kleptocracies are sustained, citizens lose faith in their governments, and in some cases, political instability and violent conflict follow. But corruption harms extend well beyond borders. For industry players, corruption creates costly inefficiencies and raises the risk of doing business. Illicit funds move around the world, destabilizing markets and weakening institutions as they spread. For the planet and for future generations, corruption could be an obstacle to realizing a just and timely energy transition if fossil fuel sector vested interests are allowed to buy influence, or if corruption disrupts the stable supply of minerals critical to renewable technologies. At NRGI, we work to ensure that lessons from past corruption cases help to prevent corruption in the future. Last year, we launched a tool for diagnosing extractive sector corruption so that EITI chapters, civil society groups, donors, and many others can identify the most urgent corruption risks in their country. We're also ramping up work on anti-corruption in critical minerals, noting that the demand for minerals essential for renewable technologies is expected to increase 5 times by 2050. And mindful of the very serious corruption risks that can accompany such commodity booms. Today, we will focus on yet another timely and critical issue. How can state-owned enterprises and their private sector partners put in place more effective safeguards against corruption? Addressing these specific corruption challenges, of course, demands action from multiple stakeholders. Over the past 2 years, we have developed strong collaboration with key partners, including the OECD, the EITI, leading NGOs in this space, such as the Basel Institute, TI's Sustainable Mining Program, Global Witness, and Public Eye, many extractive sector and anti-corruption experts, our pro bono partner and leading law firm Cleary Gottlieb, and many companies and SOEs. We recognize that these discussions often touched on very sensitive issues, and your contributions and candor are hugely appreciated. We believe that this collaboration, if followed up by concerted collective action, shows the art of the possible. We have all seen the costs of corruption. The question at hand is how the industry's players will now respond. Thank you all again for joining us today from around the world, and I look forward to the discussion. I'll now hand it over to the leader of this work, Dr. Alexandra Gillies, an expert on extractive sector corruption and author of the book Crude Intentions: How Oil Sector Corruption Contaminates the World. Alex, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sunita, and welcome everyone. It's really exciting to be with you here today to launch this project that we've been working on for a few years. As Sunita mentioned, we at NRGI have invested in analyzing hundreds of past corruption cases in the oil, gas, and mining sector. One very clear trend is the vulnerability of state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, to corruption. The reasons for this are pretty straightforward. Extractive sector SOEs allocate lucrative business opportunities, they control a lot of money, and they tend to maintain very close relationships with a country's political elites. SOE corruption takes a few different forms. Certainly bribery is one of them. Recent anti-bribery cases show that private sector companies paid bribes to SOE officials in Algeria, Angola, Azerbaijan, Brazil, Ecuador, Equatorial Guinea, Indonesia, Iraq, Mexico, Nigeria, the Republic of Congo, Russia, and Thailand, among others, which I think gives a sense of the scale of the challenge. SOEs have also acted in ways that favor politically connected companies. Under previous governments, several years ago, Nigeria's and Brazil's national oil companies awarded contracts containing overly favorable terms to selected companies that had strong political ties. Public officials have misappropriated SOE funds. Last month, new revelations questioned the whereabouts of about $500 million paid by the DRC's national mining company to the government. Next door, US authorities alleged that a senior official in the Republic of Congo withdrew money from national oil company accounts and used the money to buy a condo in Miami, Florida. Given the scale of SOEs and the vital public responsibility that they have, these forms of corruption, as Sunita mentioned, have inflicted very serious harm on many resource-rich countries. Now, I want to be really clear. Many different types of companies have engaged in extractive sector corruption. This is far from an SOE problem. And many SOEs operate with integrity. But the various forms of SOE corruption are common enough and harmful enough to warrant some special attention. So much of the work on this challenge of SOE governance focuses on the reforms that the SOE itself or its government shareholders could take around transparency and corporate governance. This is very important work, and some SOEs are making major advances. But two factors suggested to us that this approach of pushing SOE reform is not on its own sufficient. First, in many countries where SOE corruption is a big problem, there's very little political will to reform those companies. Often it's the people in charge who are the beneficiaries of the corruption, so they're quite satisfied with the status quo. Second is that SOEs don't work in a vacuum. These are global entities who partner with companies from around the world. Many SOEs depend quite heavily on other companies for financing and certain technical capacities, and those company partners have some influence. But when we've looked back at the record of corruption cases, it's clear that some of these corruption partners have been complicit, either as direct participants in the corruption, as enablers, or just by turning a blind eye. So these two factors led us to look at the role of the international partners of SOEs. In particular, we focused on three types of companies that very often work with SOEs: exploration and production companies, service companies and subcontractors, and commodity traders. And again, this is across the oil and gas industry as well as mining. That said, many of the recommendations would also apply to banks, lenders, law firms, accountancies who also work with SOEs. One quick caveat here, because I know the people who registered to be here are a really diverse mix. For many of you, this specific scenario is directly relevant. For those of you who it's not, don't worry, many of the issues we're going to talk about today have a much wider relevance as well. But these SOE partnerships create some unique circumstances. On one hand, many of the companies that partner with SOEs are very motivated to prevent corruption. They're concerned about legal and reputational risks. ESG factors are a big deal in the sector right now, and that includes concerns around integrity. And corruption can impede operations. It can, erode efficiency, add costs, and I think most importantly, create an uneven playing field. Now, with other third parties like a supplier or a consultant, when companies uncover concerns around corruption, they have a lot of options. They can choose not to work with that third party, or they can require that it adopt all kinds of extra controls. Relationships with SOEs can be quite different. SOEs tend to be extremely powerful within the extractive sector of their countries, which means they can be quite difficult to influence. In many cases, working with the SOE is mandatory if you want to invest in that country. For some companies, they've invested millions, if not billions of dollars in partnership, in projects in partnership with SOEs, so that it can't just kind of walk away from those investments when corruption concerns arise. Many SOE relationships have been in place for decades. And corruption standards have evolved a lot in the sector, but maybe those practices, the practices within those partnerships have not. And SOEs have some inbuilt political risks, meaning that SOE officials count as politically exposed persons. And so working with an SOE has kind of inherent political risks associated with it. So given all that complexity and kind of the unique nature of these partnerships, standard compliance and anti-corruption guidance felt out of touch with the specifics of the situation. It also seemed out of touch with the record of corruption in this space and how much harm it's caused. The existing prescriptions were just falling short too often. So we decided to research this further to understand what might be done, what practical options are available to companies and SOEs to prevent future corruption. So to explain our process, let me now hand over to Tom Shipley, who is a co-author of the guidance that we're launching today, and a researcher at the Sussex Center for the Study of Corruption. Tom, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. So this is a project which we started in mid-2019. We began by reviewing what anti-corruption guidance was already out there for companies and SOEs. And there are a lot of relevant materials, and you will see that we draw on these in the report, especially anti-corruption and governance frameworks produced by organisations like the OECD, Chatham House, EITI, and Transparency International. The gap we see is that many compliance frameworks don't necessarily speak to the circumstances and the dilemma that Alex described. So what can companies do when the options are limited? How do companies respond to the very particular risks created by SOEs? Or what do we need to do if existing compliance systems appear to be falling short? One of the methods we've relied on a lot is to look at the detail of past corruption cases. And we've used this research to establish common fact patterns across cases and to understand more about where the problem areas lie and what measures might have prevented corruption from taking place. We've also consulted widely with industry and experts. We held a first meeting in December 2019, where we brought together 30 people from extractive sector companies, financial institutions, consultancies, NGOs, and universities. And we used this meeting to help set our areas of focus. We have a core group of 18 international companies who've remained involved throughout the whole process. And we followed up with one-to-one interviews with companies and experts to understand more about current practice, what obstacles people saw, and what might be viable options to introduce. We developed these ideas and tested them in a further 5 closed-door workshops, one on each of our main topics. And we refined the suggestions we made. We've produced drafts, and these are reviewed by all the participants. We've also engaged with several SOEs, including large industry leaders and small companies in new producer countries. In total, we've had over 110 people from over 50 organisations contributing to this guidance over the last 2 years. And I think what has been most interesting for us to see how engaged and forthcoming the industry was in this process, which, to be frank, has not always been our experience. But we think this speaks to how this is a genuinely tricky issue where companies are seeking new ideas. So I'll just take a moment to highlight some of the defining features of the guidance and the areas which it does and does not try to cover. So we followed a problem-focused approach, and we're not seeking to be comprehensive. We use a consultation process to establish the areas which are most challenging and where more learning and improved practices are needed. And we respond to the specific issues around company and SOE interaction. So the guidance is not focused on common corruption issues like facilitation payments and gifts and hospitality, because there are other materials available for that. The guidance is also a mix of basic and ambitious measures. Some recommendations represent good practices companies have already adopted and which could be mainstreamed. Others are more ambitious, and we recognise that they may carry commercial costs and may be difficult to implement, but we believe they are justified given the record of corruption in the sector in these known areas of risk. And finally, in line with NRGI's mission, we've also created guidance which prioritises the public interest in producing countries, which is somewhat different from many sources of compliance guidance, which prioritise the protection of companies from regulatory, legal and reputational risks. For instance, we push companies to assess and avoid enabling more systemic forms of corruption, such as kleptocracy, even though these scenarios may not create direct legal liabilities for the company. Also, it's no surprise we're pushing for higher transparency and disclosure, because we believe this is a key part of how companies can contribute to an open and accountable extractive sector. The full guidance can be downloaded at this link, and we'll also drop that in the chat to share it around. There's also a great new microsite where you can look at specific topics and explore certain areas that are of interest in more detail. So the guidance is organised around 5 main topics. We start with due diligence, and we ask international companies to supplement their approaches to address the distinct risks presented by SOEs. So that means looking more closely at the political and economic context in which the SOE is operating to identify different types of corruption risks. And because SOEs are publicly owned and held to different standards of accountability and governance, due diligence should also assess the SOE's record against those standards. So we put forward some practical measures for making sure due diligence is actually a meaningful exercise which influences business decisions, including whether a transaction with an SOE should proceed at all. Next are recommendations 2 and 3, and Alex and I will talk in a moment about those. The recommendations in part 4 respond to another known problem area, which is large-scale misappropriation from SOEs, which can include the misappropriation of funds paid to them by international companies. Now, this is a tricky issue for companies. It's not an issue they can fully control, and as a result, they often prefer to see it as a challenge which is beyond their scope of concern. We don't share that perspective, and the guidance calls on companies to explicitly include misappropriation risk in their due diligence and adopt some basic financial controls and collaborate with other stakeholders on supporting improved financial accountability at SOEs. Joint ventures are another important venue where companies and SOEs collaborate. Again, it can be difficult to reach agreement on anti-corruption controls in the joint venture if the partners are coming from very different perspectives. We heard, for instance, of one case where the partners had struggled to update the anti-corruption framework in a joint venture going back to the 1970s. So in the guidance, we put forward some core principles against which joint venture partners could jointly evaluate their anti-corruption systems and then agree and adopt measures to address concerns. So they cover important areas such as integrity in procurement and guarding against potential conflicts of interest and inappropriate forms of political influence. And lastly, we've also developed complementary SOE guidance. So for each recommendation, we asked what reciprocal steps SOEs can take. Again, this is not comprehensive SOE guidance. It's a concise set of good practices that address proven corruption risks. So we're just going to talk about a couple of the topics in more detail to give you a sense of the recommendations. So the first is agents. The selection of this topic was really driven by our past case analysis. Agents feature in nearly all the cases.
Sorry, Tom, you might want to flip the slide.
Oh, sorry. Great, thank you. So agents feature in nearly all the cases that we looked at. But this is also a good example of a topic where there's already some progress and which the recommendations reflect and build on. One particular type of agent which is prone to involvement in corruption are business development agents. These are the entities and individuals which companies hire to help them win business, including from SOEs. The unit all case is a well-known example, and it shows the global reach and damage these cases can cause. This is a Monaco-based company involved in bribery in at least 8 countries to help its clients, so large oilfield service companies, to win business. It's clear, however, from our engagement with companies that few actively want to use agents, but many are pushed to do so because it's a formal requirement, or there's informal pressure to use an agent, or they feel it's commercially necessary because they don't have a market presence. During the project, many companies were already reforming their use of agents. Some had publicly announced that they would stop using agents, but others had taken that step privately. Every company we talked to had reduced the number of business development agents they use and had adopted additional controls. Using agents is nonetheless still deeply ingrained into ways of doing business in the industry, especially among service and oil trading companies. So at the core of the guidance on agents is the recommendation that companies stop using business development agents to represent their interests when seeking new business from SOEs. So we make the case that because the evidence shows that winning business from SOEs typically brings elevated risks, it is better to not add in a layer of risk and complexity through an intermediary. As companies reduce their use of agents, we also need to be careful about not simply displacing risk to another area. If employees pick up tasks previously undertaken by agents, we need to be careful they don't end up picking up the corruption risks as well. We outline additional controls companies can apply to other types of agents, including avoiding success fees for contracts, which can generate a win-at-all-costs mentality, requiring business to explicitly justify the legitimate and unavoidable need to use an agent as part of their compliance checks. And we'd like to see more reform, collaboration, and collective action among companies and SOEs on this topic. One area which could help advance the agenda is more transparency. So we looked at 25 company policies, and companies tend to avoid saying little publicly about how they manage agent risk. So we're calling for companies to disclose their agent policies, as well as a list of the agents they use and their beneficial owners, recognizing that this is far from straightforward, but arguing there's a strong societal case for doing so. And this can actually be part of a preventative strategy for reducing corruption risks. And actually on the SOE side, some SOEs are already taking steps to reduce the use of agents in their procurement and contracting systems. And the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, which have prohibited the use of agents for oil purchases, is as one example. So overall, this is an area which is ripe for reform, because agents add costs for both private companies and SOEs. Recent corruption cases should also motivate action, and there's some momentum given the measures companies are already implementing.
I'm going to briefly describe one other part of the guidance before we then hand over to our panel. So another part of the guidance tackles this challenge of how should companies respond when their third-party due diligence uncovers political exposure. So which politically exposed entities are okay to work with and which ones aren't. Many corruption cases show what happens when they make the wrong choice. I saw that this week marks the 2nd anniversary of the Luanda leaks. Many companies decided that it was fine to work with Isabel dos Santos, the daughter of the former Angolan president, despite pretty widely known concerns regarding corruption. And then the Luanda leaks provided even more detail about the specific red flags these partners ignored or overlooked, and they faced a lot of reputational harm as a result. Companies often have to make judgment calls about whom to work with. In business with SOEs, these issues often arise around vetting suppliers, equity partners, intermediaries in oil sale deals, and others. These decisions can be complicated and context-specific. Companies explain to us some of the challenges, like when all the qualified options are politically connected, or if they face pressure to use a certain politically connected party, or if they lack clear information about an entity's true owners. This is difficult, but we believe the recommendations put forward some ideas that could help reduce the corruption risks involved. First, companies should publicly commit upfront that they won't work with certain problematic actors. And we've suggested a few restrictions on what these should be, and they're up in the slide. This is a very limited set of attributes, and they have risen in a number of corruption cases. Some companies expressed understandable concerns about how these upfront restrictions would limit their flexibility to make case-by-case judgments. However, the approach of leaving all decisions up to risk-based choices has fallen short often enough that a few limited red lines are warranted. The costs of these rules should be pretty low because there aren't that many instances where a company should want to work with an entity that has these attributes. And the advantages are significant, since clear rules would take pressure off staff having to make these judgment calls, and they would help a company to fend off calls that they work with these types of partners. So that's kind of the first measure on this area. The second one is we recommend that companies require all third parties to submit beneficial ownership information. Some companies are doing this already and report that it's working well. Third is that companies move toward, over time, publicly reporting beneficial ownership information for JV partners. And it's very exciting to see some extractive sector companies that have committed to doing this recently, but also for large suppliers and high-risk suppliers, including agents. Finally, companies should evaluate whether working with a third party that has political ties might run the risk of enabling corruption. For instance, would the deal help a political elites unduly profit from the sector? Or would it help a corrupt actor to cash in on their scheme? And in the guidance, we provide specific questions that companies can use as part of their due diligence to get at these enabling risks. I hope that gives a quick flavor of the guidance and how it reflects the patterns of corruption observed in the sector. We believe these recommendations are practical and should be adopted broadly. In terms of who might use the guidance, first, of course, are the production, service, and trading companies that work with SOEs. Of equal importance are the SOEs themselves. Some of the recommendations apply more broadly across the extractive sector and its players. In addition, the guidance could inform the work of oversight actors and activists and civil society groups as they assess, are the companies in their country doing all they can to prevent corruption and to help them push for improvements. We hope that this will also provide ideas to the range of public and private sector organizations that perform due diligence, like risk advisory groups, or that produce anti-corruption guidance and standards. And finally, some of the ideas in the guidance, especially around responding to political exposure or the enabling of corruption, speak to issues that extend well beyond the extractive sector. Everyone from mining companies to real estate agents to universities to law firms are asking, which PEPs are okay to work with and which ones are not. So there's some wider applicability here too. Along these lines, we're really eager to receive feedback, to present and discuss these ideas further, and to work with different stakeholders on putting these ideas into practice. So please be in touch with us. My email's up there, really excited to engage in more collaboration and discussion on these issues. This project and all the consultations has demonstrated to me the importance of dialogue across stakeholders. So in that spirit, we're going to stop talking now so you can hear some other perspectives. It's my pleasure to hand over to the moderator of our panel, Gemma Eolfi, the head of compliance and collective action at the Basel Institute on Governance. Gemma, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alex, and also Sunita. Thank you for the invitation to moderate this distinguished panel. It's a great pleasure to be here, and also clearly a huge amount of interest in your new work by the number of participants that we have, and that's great news. Just from my side, first of all, congratulations on the publication of the anti-corruption guidance. I think it's an interesting and well-needed set of helpful suggestions, discussions, and consultations clearly have been extremely broad and thoroughly developed, and also using the cases and developing theories from that and looking at the practice as well. It's a very impressive approach and method to the work, and with a great document as a result. One thing that has struck me from your introductory remarks, if I can just throw that in from my own experience when I was working in-house, was and if we look back over the cases of corruption cases that we know about for the last, let's say, even 20 years, the use of intermediaries and agents has been the recurring topic in all forms, pretty much, of these schemes to pay bribes. And it's interesting that it continues to be an issue, a challenge, and something that we really need to address. So I'm wondering, I mean, you're talking about collective action. There are many forms of collective action and many opportunities from this report. And I'm also thinking, when I hear this again about high-risk agents, the formal requirement to use agents and to really try and dig in on a collective action involving those governments that do require it, or those state-owned enterprises, together with a strong coalition to really address that as something that needs to be changed. But that's just one. I think there are many other topics, and of course we'll hear from our panel in a moment. But thank you for that. Before I go any further, I should kindly ask the participants, if you would like to raise questions, there is a Q&A function. Please don't hesitate to use that, and we will try to integrate questions after we've heard from the panel. And that, of course, brings me to this distinguished group with a wealth of experience and expertise on this topic. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Christy Shires, who's Head of Compliance Operations at Seadrill. It's a company that specializes in offshore drilling. Then we have Scott Sullivan, who is Chief Integrity and Compliance Officer at the large global mining company that's really well known, Newmont. Welcome. And we have George Cazenove, who's Head of Corporate Affairs at Tullow Oil. This is an independent oil and gas company that works across Africa, as I understand it. Then I'm very pleased also to welcome Renata Elias, who is a Compliance Executive Manager at Petrobras, Brazil's national oil company and well known around the world. And also, and last but not least, Tom Main, who is an anti-corruption specialist who used to work at Global Witness as a researcher and is now a research fellow at the University of Exeter. So a warm welcome to all of you. And I'm going to kick off by asking a question to our company representatives, if I may, to give us a feel for, if you may, if you can, please, one or two of the anti-corruption approaches that you consider are really making a difference in your work, perhaps related to state-owned enterprises, perhaps more broadly, and perhaps you can also highlight a challenge. I'm going to start off with Christy and then go to Scott and to George. But the floor is yours, Christy, if you'd like to kick us off with that question. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gemma. Yeah, I think that the two main approaches at Seadrill that have and are continuing to make a difference are, firstly, the specific categorization of agents and joint ventures. So before, when an opportunity arises, or when we're moving into a new country or considering how to conduct an operation, and we're looking at the requirement for a joint venture or an agent, a lot more work now goes into what is it that we actually want to achieve. So really delving down into what will they do. So if we're talking about an agent, for example, what kind of agent are we looking for? Are we looking for someone because we need a license by law? Are we looking for someone to be an operational partner? Are we looking for a business development representative? And similar when we're looking at joint ventures. What that allows us to do is identify, because each of those comes with distinct risks, it allows us to identify exactly what the risk is at a very early stage and make sure that all of our workings towards that have that specific risk in mind, rather than just a general agency or general joint venture agreement. So that would be the first one. And almost hand in hand with that is the compliance function working very, very closely and hand in hand with the commercial team. So rather than decisions being made, this is where we're going, and then bringing in compliance and saying, how do we do this? It's very much a collaboration between commercial and compliance at a very early stage before we're even looking at exactly who it is where we want to approach. That agency and joint venture lifecycle goes through the implementation. It goes through initial interviews, site visits by the compliance team as well as the commercial team, through the life of the agreement, where there is constant monitoring, again, constant visits, and the relationship is maintained that way, through to the termination of the agreement. So they're the two main things that I'd point out are making a big difference to us at Seadrill.
you have any challenges that you want to throw in there for the mix for the moment, or?
Yeah, I think that the main there are always challenges. The main challenge, though, I think, is obviously the parts of the world in which we require agents in particular, and a lot of joint ventures are challenging to work in, especially when you're looking at due diligence. In a lot of these areas, it is very hard to find the information you need. Records may not be available or may not be accessible. Sometimes it's a lot harder to get through the contacts and who's related to who, and especially when we're talking about, for example, royal family involvement. And this comes on to what was said before about politically exposed persons. Who are politically exposed persons, and how do they fit into the picture? And that can be a real challenge.
Yes, thank you. I think the PEP, the politically exposed person definition, and the discussions that have gone on in the financial industry are obviously pertinent here. And clearly there's no, there's still a lack of a consistent approach to that. And that makes things difficult for everybody. Thank you very much for those initial thoughts. If I may turn to Scott with the same question. So perhaps some couple of anti-corruption approaches that you feel are really making progress in your effectiveness in your compliance program, and any challenges that you'd like to highlight at this stage. Thank you, Scott. The floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you, Gemma. So I think I'll go a little bit more general. And, a lot of times what you see are companies reacting to something in the news where they go really expensive and really sophisticated. And I think oftentimes they forget about foundational elements. And so culture is one of those, right? So if you think ethics and compliance, English history side of the brain is typically the ethics piece, and then compliance is the science math side of the brain. So that's 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. And companies can often get compliance because it kind of gets you there. You can add those things together. On the other side of the brain is the culture piece, and that's more esoteric. It's harder, it's touchy-feely, but it's such a strong foundational factor where you can have your employee base being your governors of misconduct, or watching out for all those red flags and warning signs and knowing what to do. So we've spent a lot of time focusing on expectation setting, transparency, even vulnerability, and shifting the burden from the aggrieved party, or the one where the pressure is on me, the victim perhaps, and the speak up culture, really going to, we have to create an environment that is conducive to receiving bad news, or issues being raised. So it's really the listen up culture and the act up culture as well. So you can't just listen up about a problem and then not do anything about it. And we've done a lot of engaging training sessions and videos to talk about where we do not want somebody to be put in a position where they have to sacrifice their personal or professional integrity to succeed at Newmont. So kind of culture is a real big one. And it's not that expensive. There's ways you can do that to really focus on that, engage that, because that's an often underutilized asset in an organization. The other one goes to identifying problems, whether those are people, teams, groups, regions, business practices. So we've started to put together sort of data analytics, marrying that with behavioral science, trying to develop what I would call generically a hotspot identifier tool. So if you can get to problems before they blow up, they metastasize, they become huge, they impact the entire organization, or on a human front, they impact somebody's career. So if you can intervene, I mean, we always think about, unfortunately, you're focusing on the 1 to 2% of bad actors, not the 98% of the healthy body who could make a bad decision on a given day, given the environment or a pressure they're facing. So really trying to early radar or early warning to sort of develop on those two fronts. And then I'll pick up on maybe on the challenge a little bit with Christy as well. The challenge of getting data. So where is it? How do you find it? But also then you have the other side, which is the tsunami of data. So you have massive data influxes on some areas and some things. And so picking what is relevant and teasing out all of that, I think, is becoming a much bigger challenge, especially as regulators are pushing data analytics, data science, get all this data. How do you tease out the relevant factors to better inform your program, gauge the risks, and direct your precious resources to these higher risk areas?
Thank you for that. I think it's very interesting that you highlight behavioral aspects first, and then combining then data at the end there. Of course, combining those two things would be where many companies are trying to head, as in, so we want to have a cultural change. We want to have more speak up, listen up, act up, and measuring that and finding data points for that. If you have insights into that, maybe we can hear about those later or separately. It's a very interesting area and one that many companies I know are wrestling with, and it's a very interesting one. So thank you for that. If I may turn to George, perhaps you can add to the range of approaches that are really making a difference, in your opinion, in your company. And perhaps some challenges as well. Thank you. George, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Gemma. Thanks to the team for having me on the call. I think, as I have on previous calls, I'll probably give the slightly smaller company perspective. Seadrill and Newmont are giants compared to Tullow, so we are a much smaller company. I think our perspective comes from a couple of areas. I think in terms of the approach that makes a difference, I completely concur with Scott's view around culture. And the way that we do that within Tullow is through education. There's no other way. And that is a transparent process from top to bottom, where every single member of staff, every single board director, the chair, plus permanent contractors are required to take a training course once a year, 45 minutes online, slightly tedious, slightly annoying, causes people to be frustrated with the system as they have to listen very carefully to what's being said to them. And yet once they do it, they're always surprised by things they pick up within those courses. And they're always pleased to get to the end of the course, but I think pleased that they've learned something as well. And that requires, in terms of, that actually goes into the director's bonuses and has to be completed 100% in order to qualify within their remuneration package. I think that's the first thing. I think within that education package, it's trying to persuade people to understand what corruption is, especially, not so much what corruption is, but what risky behaviour is, and getting them to understand the categories of risky behaviour and where they might get caught out. And I think that's our biggest issue around education is explaining to people that it's not about brown envelopes or payments. It's actually, there's much more to this problem than simply what you might have seen in the movies, and persuading people that corruption is more than what they may have seen culturally. So I think that's our best approach. Education is clearly the way that we do things, and that 100% sign up to the online course is very, very important. In terms of agents, I mean, this is something it's not something that Tullow has a particular issue with around agents, because new business for an exploration and production company like Tullow involves trying to get exploration licenses potentially in countries and areas where there haven't been that much drilling before. So if you think about exploration licenses and what you're committing to when you're working with a new government, you are actually signing up to liabilities rather than assets. An exploration license is a liability, not an asset. So therefore, if you're signing up to a liability, you're unlikely to need an agent to get you into that. That, of course, is different in established oil provinces where everyone knows where there are license rounds, where there are established oil fields that people want to get after. That's a totally different area of new business, and I can see where agents would certainly be involved with that. But on the more sort of wildcat, more sort of speculative end of the industry where Tullow sits, I think it's very much agents are not necessarily something that we would need to use. I think our biggest challenge, and this comes from the small company aspect, and also, dare I say, that the smaller countries in which we work, is simply that oil and gas can be an important part of a company's foreign direct investment, an important part of their hard currency as well, and it's an important part of their economy, which means, and their political economy as well, which means that in fact, trying to deal with governments, trying to work with local partners, trying to improve local content, for example, it's very difficult with small ecosystems not to come across PEPs when you're working there. And I think that's in many ways the hardest challenge that we find, is that the countries in which we work in Africa, and I'm thinking particularly Ghana, Kenya, the political elites are very, very small, and they're very, very influential. So having to navigate those elites and navigate them diplomatically as well, and then discover that they're also part of the potential supply chain as well, is very, very hard indeed. I mean, as ever in these things, transparency is the best way to move forward, being clear through contracting processes on what is required, what declarations are required, but it can be very, very challenging in those countries with very small and very influential political elites to navigate the issues, particularly around politically exposed persons. So there you are. That's it for me. Back to you, Gemma. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your very open assessment of the challenges there. I think that's helpful for others to hear, and it's by bringing those out in real examples that we can start to understand the issues and then hopefully start to address them as well. Renata, if I may turn to you now, as you are working in a state-owned enterprise that has undertaken major anti-corruption reforms, as is well known, we understand that Petrobras now invests in screening its third parties, looking for possible conflicts of interest. Perhaps you could give us a little bit of a flavor of how the experience of implementing these kinds of reforms has developed in Petrobras, and perhaps give some inspiration to other state-owned enterprises that are having to look at this once more. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gemma. And just to give an overview of Petrobras, I believe that one important background of our company is that we are a state-owned enterprise, but also we are a company that have shares publicly traded in the US and the Brazilian stock market. So even though we are an SOE, we also have a mix of composition in which we are subject not only to the government, but also from the stakeholders and the public trade scrutiny of our stakeholders. And also to give an overview in the past, that it's not that far, between 2014 and 15, we were in the middle of a corruption scandal in Brazil that was called a car wash operation. And this operation, even though Petrobras was understood as a victim, we were talking about a scheme that involved intermediaries, suppliers of the company, political interference, and the relationship of the company with the Brazilian government. So when we did our root cause analysis of everything that happened in the company, we came to the conclusion that third parties was an important issue that we had to adjust and to improve. So the first decision that we had to make was how to implement a due diligence process, but take into consideration that we had a very strong bidding process. In Brazil, as a state-owned company, we are subject to procurement law regulation. So we need to follow several steps. And integrity is not something that it's very clear on how we should put these elements when we are selecting a supplier, for instance, in a tender process. So we had some green zone, some gray zone that we had to discuss internally, and also to think how we would impact on the company itself, its procurement process, and the suppliers itself. And also thinking about, as a state-owned enterprise, and the impacts that we have in the Brazilian society. And just to give you a clue, some numbers, in 2020, we had more than $53 billion in net revenue, which is about 4% of the Brazilian GDP. We have more than 2,000 contracts and more than 50 billion contracts that it's demanded for Petrobras. So we have a big impact in the society. And that's where we decided that not only we were wondering and wanting to improve our internal process, but also the society. So nowadays, when we conduct a due diligence, we look for, we have a questionnaire where we ask the company about the profile, the relationship with government and public officials. We also ask about the use of intermediaries, agents, if there is a compliance program in place. Sometimes we conduct interviews and we request for documents in order to understand how is the compliance program of that supplier. And the result of this assessment is a grade. And if the supplier is rated as a high-risk supplier, this supplier cannot be part of the bidding process in Petrobras, which means that we are not willing to have a relationship, and we are talking about contracts of more than 20 years and about $1 billion involved. So that's why we decided to raise the bar. This decision was made by our board of directors. It's public. We like to give a lot of transparency on the items that we evaluate and how this evaluation will be taken into consideration when we are talking about a procurement process. And in the beginning, the suppliers were very not into it. They were trying to deny or even questioning in court this procedure that Petrobras implemented. But nowadays, more than 7 years from the beginning of this project, we already have suppliers that comes to Petrobras and wants to improve their compliance program. So by doing the due diligence, we understand that we are pushing the market, we are raising the bar in Brazilian, and we understand that we can make a good spread of the compliance perspective in our suppliers and also in their subcontractors, because if we demand a strong compliance program from our suppliers, they will also demand that from their chain of supplier as well. So as an SOE, we understand that we have an important role in the Brazilian markets, and definitely the due diligence is something that we have to attack.
Thank you. That's a really interesting approach. I just have a quick question, if I may, just as a clarification, if I can just insert that at this point. You said that high risk, those that are subject to due diligence and come out as high risk are not permitted to bid, or not to become permitted to become a supplier to Petrobras. Do you have a process? And then you said that companies are interested in improving and changing and making their compliance programs more robust. So do you have a process to have another look at them if they claim that they have changed things? Is that dynamic, or is it you can't reapply for 3 years or 5 years, or how do you handle that?
No, it's dynamic, Gemma. We usually wait for 6 months up to 1 year to do the reassessment. But as I told you, that some of them in the beginning denial, sometimes they don't give enough information or disclosure on what we need to do the assessment. So this is something that we work with them, because in the bottom, we don't want to have high risk suppliers. We want them to improve. So we have this around 6 months policy in order to do the reassessment whenever we understand that they need to improve practice, because you don't implement a program and say that it's working with less than 6 months. But this time of reassessment depends also in the pending points that we have in our due diligence process.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And very interesting statistics there. So good to know that you're making that public. Thank you for the moment. Let me turn to Tom, who's our last speaker in this first round. Tom, you have a completely different background, I think, to pretty much all the other speakers, in that you are a researcher and an expert on this topic. and you've been investigating corruption and analysing how these schemes can function. Perhaps you could give us your perspective on how things currently stand, and when it comes to company due diligence, and specifically how companies can really avoid enabling corruption, which I think is very much the focus of this guidance. What are the keys, in your opinion, to actually preventing future problems? So there's a few questions in there, but the floor is yours. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Gemma, and thanks to NRGI for the invitation to speak. I think the awareness of corruption and the improvement of the due diligence process has evolved over the years. I think in the 90s, the corporate belief really was, it wasn't our place to tell a government how to receive funds or which JV partners or agents it chooses. I think in the 2000s, with the introduction of the concept of the politically exposed person via the Financial Action Task Force, there was, I think, an increasing an awareness. But for some companies, not all, but for some, it was still a box ticking exercise. I think now we are in a much better situation. We have much more awareness of the cornucopia of corruption risks that companies face. And of course, we have many more media organizations and NGOs reporting on corruption, many more data leaks, of course, the 3 Ps, Panama Paradise and Pandora Papers. So companies, I think, understand better the corruption risks and the importance of doing good due diligence, not turning a blind eye, and going into deals with the thought, how does this look if this becomes public? So I think my recommendations for companies going forward regarding how do you get to the bottom of these often complex political situations that you face in many of the countries you're operating in. I think my 4 recommendations would be, firstly, learn from the past. Read up on where other companies have fallen. For example, for any enforcement actions via the Department of Justice or the SEC, there was an example featuring Baker Hughes being forced to use certain agents in Kazakhstan, who were then shown to have maybe partaken in bribes. So you can read those legal documents and ask yourself, well, how could we have done this differently? What would we have done? I think secondly, before performing due diligence, have some definite red lines. These, of course, should be enshrined in anti-corruption guidelines and your best practice procedures, but there may be things specific to particular deals you want to think about before conducting due diligence. I think thirdly, and this is quite important, just ensure that the due diligence is independent and that there is a separation from the due diligence team or external company if you're using one, and your company's senior management. You need to ensure that there is no pressure or influence placed on the due diligence process that might skew the findings. And I think fourthly, publish what you can. And Alex and Tom touched on this earlier. It's very unlikely you can publish due diligence reports because of confidentiality, and you want these documents to be a kind of open and unfiltered discussion of the risks. But I think you can publish details of the kinds of processes and research that you have conducted. And as Tom alluded to, you can go on record and say, you won't work with agents or with this or that politically exposed person. So all in all, I think my general answer to your question is for companies to go further. It's now no longer good enough just to say, well, we gave some money to a local authority to build a school. If that school is not going to be built, it's no good to say, well, this person wasn't on the politically exposed person database if there is information out there which suggests that that person does have political ties. So in general, I think the situation is much more improved from where we were 30 years ago. But as this great new report from NRGI highlights, there's a lot more companies can be doing, and I think this is the first step in hopefully further collaboration between the NGO sector and the corporate sector about how we can improve things in these countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for those broad brush overview, very helpful. One of the things that Alex said at the beginning was encouraging companies to publish their policies on agents. And this is something that we have also from the Basel Institute side also encouraged. But what we hear from companies back again, and perhaps this is also familiar to those on this, this webinar now, is that they often say, companies often say, in our policy, we actually have confidential information that if we were to publish it, it could end up with us being involved in antitrust issues, competition issues, and sometimes companies even say we even put in the scale of remuneration that we have, which of course is not necessarily the right place to put these, and so find reasons why not to publish. But I take on board, Tom, what you're saying is that wherever possible, policies and so on should be published. I think some years ago, there was a reluctance to publish anti-corruption policies. Now that's much more standard. And now we're moving into the more detailed, what are you actually doing with your agents and intermediaries, and show us what your policies are. So I think keeping this moving and this momentum is very important. I noticed that there's a question from the participants, from the audience, from Elizabeth Avila, who asks, related to this topic, how do companies judge whether the fees demanded by agents are proportionate? So here we're getting into the nitty-gritty of what's a reasonable fee for reasonable work, and avoiding, of course, the success fee element. I don't know whether one of the companies would like to give an overview as to how you determine what is a reasonable fee. Christy, would you like to take that? Thank you.
Yeah, I can jump in, Gemma, sorry. Yeah, I think it's more than you need to dig deep into what is a reasonable fee. And I think the first thing is, what are they doing? So it's not as simple as what is the market rate in that country, because that's often a discussion. It's a good place to start, because I think the first thing is that each market is different, each location is different, each service is different. So that's your starting point. But then another thing is to look at exactly what are you asking your agent to do, and actually going through almost line by line, and then making sure that as they're doing it, and this goes to ongoing monitoring, as they're providing the services, ensuring every time you're making a payment that payment is against services that have been provided. So everything that you're paying, you can clearly justify against the service that's been provided by that agent.
In that, do you also, once you've done that exercise, then say, well, actually, all the things we're asking them to do, 50% of them, 90% of them, we could do ourselves. Does that help that?
Yeah, it does. And you know, I said at the beginning, one of the things is when you're looking at agents, start from the very beginning as to what is it you want them to do, and is there another way of doing it? So it may be that as you're going through, you decide you actually don't need an agent 2 or 3 years down the track. So you know, maybe you're becoming more comfortable operating in a country, and where you did need an agent, maybe you don't. So I think it's the ongoing monitoring of the agents are quite important, and the services that you're using them for is a good indication of that.
Thanks. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in. Christy said that you look at each specific case, you look at each specific country. I don't know if others have a different approach to that and try and have maybe limits or ceilings or different approaches that are comparative. I don't know if it's Scott or Renata or George would like to come in on that. Scott,
we don't have sales agents per se. So in the distribution channel, we don't have that. So most of our risk is on the supply side or the consulting type agent for permits, licensings, et cetera. So, but you same thing, you have to assess the need for them. And I think from, you know, commercially speaking, on the distribution side, I think there's also a rationalization opportunity. So a lot of times you can have, hey, is there a business justification for an agent or a representative? Yes, but then you have in a particular country, jurisdiction, project, whatever it may be, you have 5 or 6. So certainly do you need 5 or 6? And a lot of times it's a beauty pageant up to the 11th hour. And before you actually engage the agent, the misconduct is done in that beauty pageant, because it's it's win-lose. It's 100%. They either get it or they don't. And so the bad behavior can actually be occurring up to the 11th hour before you turn into the pumpkin.
When you say you've got five or six,
sorry, Jim.
Sorry, go ahead, Renata. Sorry, go ahead. I'll come back.
I just would complement saying that the partnership with the business that it's trying to hire these agents, they usually trying to understand why they want and what is the background of this agent, because usually the area that it's more upfront in the company has a lot of information. So it's also a challenge for the compliance team to try to really understand and to get the information that usually the operational area already has.
Thank you. George, do you want to come in and add something on this?
Yeah, I only wanted to add a small point, which is to say that the issue around agents. So if you're thinking about entering a new market, you're trying to find an agent to act for you or to help you. Okay, so you've entered a new market, the agent might have helped you. You now need to set up. And the same issues that you've had potentially with an agent will come into employment. So you need to build a local office, you need to hire the right office, you need to employ logistics companies, catering, security, whatever it might be. And again, you have the same, I think, certainly from our perspective, the agent is one thing and concentrating on the agent is important, but actually in that entering and setting up a company, you're consistently setting up in the country, you're consistently coming across these types of issues of trying to understand who your suppliers are, who you're working with, and what their connections are within the local political economy that you're dealing with. So while the focus on agents is helpful for many companies, it's not so helpful for us, but it's something. But the read across from the warnings around agents certainly goes across into other aspects of our work, particularly as we set up and operate in a new country of operations. Thank you.
Thank you. Scott, I just wanted to come back on something you said. You said that sometimes you might find that you've got multiple agents in the same territory, in the same location. And so my question on that is, do you have centralized, and perhaps all the companies have this, centralized information on your agents so that actually do have a very strong overview as to who you've got where and what they're doing and how much and so on? Is that centralized, or do you get surprised sometimes?
Yeah, I think that, so again, we don't have that context because we don't have sales agents, but so from experience that's often the inventory effort is critical, right? To make sure you know who are all your third parties, agents being a component of that. What risks do they present? Can they get into your system and be activated without approval from the compliance team? So the inventory is absolutely critical. And I think, particularly on the Salesforce distribution side, for a variety of reasons, there can often be, it could be a project-specific agent, but looking at that rationalization effort, you can have the business be your partner and looking at that and saying, do we really need these, just pure business, not anything to do with compliance? And you can kind of co-opt them into the process of saying, well, look, you can save a whole bunch of money, and then they become allies in the process of really helping you question the business justification for those parties.
Thanks, Tom. I don't know whether you want to add anything here on this topic about beyond what you said.
I don't think I've got anything for this one.
Okay, thank you. Just moving on then, another question from the chat is, have companies faced any legal challenges as they introduce due diligence requirements? And the other question, maybe I'll put that out there as well, do companies have examples of where they've had to adapt their compliance program to local circumstances? Perhaps looking at how companies balance local content requirements and their compliance program. So two different questions there. I don't know whether anybody would like to pop up. Tom.
Seeing us skirted the last question, I'll take this one. Well, I mean, I think this also relates to something you said, Gemma, just a moment ago about, are there confidentiality issues or reasons why we can't put certain information in the public domain? And I think this is an argument that has been used by governments for years, dating back to the beginning of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Some governments said, no, we can't, this is confidential information about what money we're receiving from companies. Yet NGOs and companies got together and said, no, we think this is going to be beneficial for the industry as a whole. And with this collective action, it was move forward, and now it's just a matter of course that these revenues are reported via the IITF process, and sometimes as part of government law in some countries. So there may be certain aspects of the due diligence process that companies will and countries will say have to remain confidential. But I think if you know the corporate world gets together on certain issues, and sometimes this can be quite tricky to do, and say, no, you know, we are going to publish information. Alex mentioned earlier, you know, the publishing of beneficial ownership information, for example, on JV partners. If that becomes industry standard, then it becomes industry standard, and governments have to adapt to that. So I don't think we should be, you know, even though there are sometimes issues regarding certain bits of information, I don't think we should be cowed into just accepting whatever government X says, which may have it an ulterior motive for keeping certain information hidden.
Does anybody want to come in on local content versus their compliance program and moderating their global standards down to or up to local? Do you encounter that as a request from the business, and how do you deal with it? Scott, you want to come in?
Yeah, I can say certainly on the supply side. So I think the sophistication of local parties, it can often be an issue. If you're in far remote regions like we are, sometimes you deal with a very, very small pool of candidates, whether it's for employment or suppliers or vendors. So it's really a challenge. And sometimes you sort of have the situation where the mayor owns the gas station and the funeral home, so to speak, and you've got to really deal through that politically exposed party issue. And you're often left with very few alternative choices that are there. So navigating that and putting in place the controls that you can to mitigate that risk is really, really important. And staying on top of that and monitoring is absolutely critical. Trying to develop the supply base is another thing I think we're doing a pretty good job on, so that you have alternatives there, and you're also giving back to the community in that sense. So I think it's absolutely a challenge. And frankly, the big issue for me with PEPs are there's no one-stop shop for a database, and everybody has proprietary databases. And so this one may know it and this one doesn't. This company may be great in this jurisdiction, and sort of sussing that out or sorting that out, like UBO, so ultimate beneficial ownership, it's just really, really tough to find that good source of data in the particular places you are.
Absolutely, and I think that's you've hit a good topic there, and something that has been in discussion for many years, certainly in the financial industry and elsewhere. And obviously, getting good data is crucial. George, I'm going to hand it over to you for this question on local content and global standards.
Yeah, I think. I mean, this may feel a bit of a simplistic answer, but you know, Tullow, like our colleagues at Seadrill and Newmont, work in very technical businesses where you know, health and safety is a key priority, and we wouldn't, when it comes to safety and technical ability, we wouldn't reduce our standards around that. So I don't see why we would reduce them elsewhere. So in terms of local content, you know, the way that we would deal it both technically, also financially, is to assist companies that could enter the supply chain and train them effectively, so they then reach the standards that are required to be a supplier to Tullow. So I think that's the way around we deal with the local content issue. But I think you have to keep the standards have to be what they are. They have to stay where they are, and we have to require the local market to meet them rather than coming down if that's what's being asked for.
Thank you, George. Thank you for that clear answer and the clear line, the red line that we're talking about here. Christy or Renata, do you want to add anything? Christy?
Yeah, I'd echo what George has said. Yeah, our standards are our standards. We don't lower them because there's a particular challenge. But that said, and I guess this is similar to what Scott was saying, that there may be that we are tied in some respect on how we do something. That doesn't mean we lower our standards. It may mean that we find another mitigating step that is going to keep those standards. But the standards remain. And I guess the only other thing I'd add is going back to earlier in the panel and talking about education and culture, and ensuring that our people on the ground in challenging locations are aware not only of what our processes are, but why we have those processes. So if they understand why we're doing what we do, then they are much more likely to bring challenging issues to our attention. When I say our, I mean someone in the compliance team or someone in the operations team that can assist them with a challenge or a problem that's arisen.
Thank you for that. Renata, did you want to add something?
Yes, I would just say that we also have a challenge on how we made our policies and procedures to flow from the headquarters into our local business units, because I think that then we are talking about culture. So sometimes something that we, for the American understanding, is very clear, but when we go to Latin America, the concept is other. So we have to adapt in order to keep the standards, but in order also to make the local area to understand what we mean with that policies, what are the risks behind and what we are trying to avoid. This is also a challenge that I understand that it's important when we are talking about global companies.
Thank you, Renata. Maybe I can switch back to the PEPs, the politically exposed persons issue that is obviously very prominent in the new guidance, and assessing which PEPs are okay to work with and which ones are not, and identifying, as I think Scott said, the beneficial ownership, the ultimate beneficial ownership is also critical and can be very difficult getting information and so on. One of the questions that has been thrown up in the chat by the colleague from the OECD is whether a state-owned enterprise representative is politically exposed is one thing, but are there other which is in itself red flag for enhanced due diligence and so on? Are there other red flags or risks that companies can or actually are looking for when considering working with an SOE that might suggest there's political intervention in the operations? So in other words, in your discussions and in developing this guidance, did you come up with other indicators for intervention in the state-owned enterprise beyond or in addition to the presence of a PEP? Don't know if anybody can shed light on that quite interesting question. Just go off mute if you'd like to take it.
Well, I'm not sure if this really answers the question, but I would say in many of the jurisdictions and places that I do research, predominantly Central Asia, I think it's impossible to have a SOE representative who isn't politically exposed in some fashion. I think George mentioned it earlier. In many of these countries, there's a very small, political elite, and they control everything. Their friends and family, and there's no way around that. But there is, I think, a way to assess the corruption risks that particular people pose, and this, may lead to, and this has happened. There is an example of not in the extractive sector, but in the telecom sector, one company actually getting somebody to sign documentation confirming that they were the ultimate beneficial owner of a particular company, get a document saying that they weren't acting on any on behalf of any high-level politicians, and saying that they would not send any of the JV proceeds to other politicians. And with this agreement in place, you perhaps, if it was broken, you'd have an opportunity to sue the person who breaks that agreement. So it is very difficult. I mean, obviously, when we're talking about red flags, we're looking at anything which doesn't make clear business sense. But when we get to this issue of being politically exposed, unfortunately, some countries, there's no way around it. Everybody's politically exposed, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can't do business with them if you put in the correct safeguards around that person.
Thanks, Tom, for that. Does anybody else want to contribute to this particular question?
Gemma, I would say and now I'm talking from a SOE perspective, I believe that the governance is a good area to look at. Because as an SOE, we have, it's by definition, a relationship with governments. But how this relationship occurs, I think that it's important. What are the Chinese walls? What are the indicating process? What are the key management of this company? How are they selected? So I think that when we look at the governance of the SOE, I think that it's something that can bring some more understanding and more clear thoughts and how is this oversight of the SOE and how is the relationship with the government. I say that in Petrobras, we put a lot of steps and a lot of walls between this relationship in order to make it more transparent and more professional.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to end up with one quick last round to you all, if I may. There's a question from a colleague in Nigeria who says, what are the best approaches to having citizens monitoring engagement with state-owned enterprises, particularly where there is opacity around those SOEs, or have media attention on them? I don't know whether any of the companies here, or whether Tom has got examples of companies actually working with citizens and to monitor state-owned enterprises. Is that something any of you have engaged in or considered or rejected or have views on? Or would consider?
I think, Gemma, I'd only say that certainly companies, I'm sure that my colleagues are the same. I mean, we are, Tullow is a member of EITI. We certainly look to work with countries that are also members of EITI. So, and I think that has become an expectation on our part as well. So I don't know about direct pressure, but I certainly think that in terms of our view as a company of our social and economic purpose as a company, I think I'll work with NGOs, both campaigning NGOs and if you like policy-driven NGOs. I think that's potentially where the work with citizens goes on. I think there was an interesting comment earlier. I think Tom said something around where governments spend their money for revenues. I'm not sure that certainly companies small as Tullow is quite at that point yet. But I think through NGOs, through those campaigning NGOs, and particularly through EITR, we are able to make clear what our own expectations are.
Thank you. Anybody want to add a quick supplement? Otherwise, I'm going to hand back to Alexandra.
I think I said the methods through which the government would receive the revenues. So you don't want to be paying into the president's offshore fund. You want to be paying into the national budget. Yeah, absolutely.
The treasury bank account. Absolutely.
You've got it. You've got it.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah. I not much to add here. I think we're all in this together. George mentioned the EITI process. I mean, this is information that's publicly available and citizens can look at. And EITI is looking at beneficial ownership now. And this is another thing that some companies may argue this is something that should remain private, but I would argue it should be put on record. Therefore, citizens and anybody can do investigations on the beneficial owners and maybe actually uncover information that the company might not itself know. So to me, and I know there are arguments against it, but to me, this would be a benefit to have that information on record. So citizens, NGOs, media, all working together to prevent corruption.
Thanks, Tom. On that note of a call for more collective action and collaboration, I'm going to hand back to Alex and say thank you very much to all the panelists for your insights and sharing your perspectives. It's been very interesting, but we're fast racing to the hour. So over to you, Alex. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. I mean, it's been fascinating to listen to this and just want to add in a few points based on the discussion. I mean, related to one of the questions, I think, a big part of the guidance deals with due diligence on SOEs. And I think, yes, all SOE officials count as public officials and therefore are PEPs. And because of that, we really urge companies to not just look at the corruption risks in the specific transaction of concern, so an oil sale or a joint venture or whatever it might be, but assess corruption risks across the SOE, and to look at kind of more systemic forms of corruption, not just transactional ones like bribery. I think that can help kind of get at some of those more complex issues of political manipulation and political agendas seeping into different NGOs. Another point on the data issue, I think that the challenges of collecting data through due diligence were explained very well. I think it's also important to keep in mind that in a number of prominent corruption cases in the sector, data collection wasn't the challenge. The parties involved knew quite well who they were working with and the corruption risks involved and decided to proceed anyway. So I think the data issue is a big one, but it's certainly not kind of the whole story when it comes to how corruption has played out in the past. Finally, I wanted to just pick up this idea of culture, which came up several times. And I know that many of you were talking about cultures within your company and kind of the importance of tackling ethics in that space. But I think the culture across the industry for many years was to keep everything very, close to the chest and to try to reduce risks by reducing engagement and reducing the amount of information that was out there. And this wasn't serving most stakeholders very well, certainly not citizens and civil society, but also investors and other players in the industry. And so it's been, I think, encouraging and appreciated that throughout this project, we've had open conversations on sensitive issues with a really wide range of industry players, and that we have, 4 companies represented here today for a public event to talk about corruption issues. And I think that spirit of openness and disclosure, which Tom talked about a lot in ways that I think are really important. So disclosure, engagement, that's also an important part of the culture change that's happening, but that needs to happen kind of even more in the future. The time is right for these advances to move forward. The extractive sector is undergoing a lot of change right now, in part driven by the energy transition. A mineral boom is coming, and we all know the corruption risks that will bring with it. On the oil and gas side, the sector's changing really fast and in unpredictable ways. And so that's creating a lot of churn, a lot of deals, new players coming in, assets changing hands, contracts being revisited, and all those transactions that I feel like I'm reading about every day carry corruption risks. So, we believe strongly that the time to strengthen these anti-corruption practices is now, not 3, 4, 5 years down the line. So with that, I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you to all the people who joined in the discussion and were here to listen today from around the world. Thank you so much to our speakers, again, for being willing to talk about these issues openly. Thank you to Gemma for an incredible job moderating the panel. And finally, I want to thank all of the participants in this project, dozens and dozens of people who debated multiple points with us over and over again and reviewed multiple drafts of the guidance. That kind of engagement really strengthened the product, and I think points to some ways forward in terms of working together to make progress in addressing this challenge. So in closing, please check out the guidance and be in touch. Our doors are open, and we look forward to more collaboration as we change the story on extractive sector corruption. So thanks again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.